In today's video, we will be talking about Queen Elizabeth of Prussia, wife of King Frederick II of Prussia. Her devotion to her husband, her mistreatment at the Prussian court, and her lifelong hope for a sign of affection make her a memorable yet tragic figure. Before we dive into her life story, I would like to introduce you to another history channel that you should definitely check out.
The Kings of France is a YouTube channel which puts its main focus on French kings, queens and their entourage. We also take a regular look at other European royal houses and take the occasional sidestep to other famous historical figures. Interested? Join me at the Kings of France.
Elisabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, or Elisabeth Christine von Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, was born on the 8th of November 1715 as the third of 13 surviving children to Duke Ferdinand Albert and Duchess Antoinette of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Not much is known about Elizabeth's childhood. What we know is that she grew up at her parents' small provincial court, where modesty and piety were top priorities. Elizabeth's education was held very basic, and her demeanor was described as sensitive and caring. While her father was in no powerful position, Elizabeth's aunt was married to the Holy Roman Emperor and thus was very influential in finding a suitable husband for Elizabeth Christine. In 1732, King Frederick Wilhelm I of Prussia was looking for a bride that would tame his unruly heir, also named Frederick. The Prussian crown prince at that time was incarcerated at the Küstrin fortress for trying to flee the country away from his brutal father. When the Prussian king was offered the hand of Elizabeth for his son Frederick, he was more than happy to accept, as he hoped to strengthen the bond to the Holy Roman Empire through her. While Elizabeth and her family were delighted about the union, Prince Frederick was reluctant to agree to the marriage. He hated his father for all his cruelty and rebelled against anything his father forced him to do. Yet, this marriage was his only chance to escape his captivity, and eventually he agreed to the wedding plans. The couple met in March 1733 for the first time. Frederick noted in a letter to his sister Wilhelmina that Elizabeth was pretty, but her teeth were terrible, her demeanor was that of a simple maid, her clothes were tasteless, her laugh was unpleasant, and conversation with her was incredibly boring. It was clear from the start that Frederick was determined to not give a chance to Elizabeth, who was forced upon him by his father. Poor Elizabeth noted Frederick's aversion and was deeply hurt, but she was determined to win him over with all her kindness and love that she felt for him from the beginning. Unfortunately, her plans were set up for failure. Despite all odds, the couple became married on the 12th of June 1733, and it was a disaster to watch. Frederick was seen crying out of desperation while putting the ring on his bride's finger, and after the ceremony was held, he went on to engage with every wedding guest, completely ignoring his new wife. After the wedding, Frederick left for his regiment, while Elizabeth stayed behind in Berlin. She had to endure a lot of animosities from her in-laws, as her mother and sisters-in-law had favored an English bride and didn't like Elizabeth's quiet nature. She probably was very overwhelmed by all the pomp of the new Prussian court and wasn't prepared for the cosmopolitan yet intricate society there. Her sisters-in-law called her everything in the book, from stupid to smelly. Poor Elizabeth was slandered. Her only friend at court was the ruling King Frederick Wilhelm, who was actually known for being a harsh, brutal soldier king, but he had a soft spot for Elizabeth. Even with all the neglect she had to endure, Elizabeth fought for Prince Frederick's affection. Frederick was held short financially by his father, so Elizabeth oftentimes helped him out with her private assets. Things started to lighten up for her in 1736, when the couple moved to their own estate, Rheinsberg Castle. Away from the always chattering Berlin court, Elizabeth was able to open up more, and Frederick, who was glad to be away from his controlling father, paid a bit more attention to his wife. These years at Rheinsberg would remain the happiest of their marriage. Elisabeth tried everything to please her husband, as she accompanied him to all social events and even extended her education by reading French Renaissance literature, all to gain Frederick's affection. This somewhat idyllic time was cut short when in 1740 King Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia died and Elisabeth and Frederick ascended the throne. From this day on, the new Prussian king kept his wife at distance. On official occasions, he was usually accompanied by either his mother or one of his sisters. Elisabeth was the new Queen of Prussia on paper, but in reality, she was shoved into the background. In 1740, the Austrian War of Succession broke out after the famous Empress Maria Theresia inherited the throne. Frederick gathered his troops and marched to Silesia, which left Elisabeth in despair. She was torn between supporting her husband and her family bond with Maria Theresia, who was a cousin of hers. Eventually, Elisabeth was on Frederick's side and she went to great lengths to support her husband, even convincing her brother to send troops to aid him. When she heard rumors about Austrian undercover agents planning an assassination on Frederick, Elisabeth sent a warning letter to Frederick, who resided at a compound with his soldiers. He was touched by his wife's concerns and thanked her for all her efforts. However, when peace was formed between Prussia and Austria in 1745, Frederick returned to his castle in Berlin without personally notifying his wife. After the war, Frederick settled into his new role as a cultivated king. He abolished torture, invited poets such as Voltaire to his court, and all forms of arts flourished under the new Prussian king. One of his dearest projects was the construction of his pleasure castle Sanssouci. Sanssouci became Frederick's summer residence and his refugium, where only close family and friends were allowed. While King Frederick and his entourage enjoyed sociable summer nights full of joie de vivre, his queen had to stay in her residence in Schönhausen, the only confidant being her superintendent. Life here was boring and monotonous. Elisabeth felt like she was buried alive and once wrote to her brother, "I stay behind in this lonesome castle like a prisoner, while everyone else is enjoying themselves. I'm delighted whenever I receive a letter from you, my dear brother. It makes me happy all day long to have a word from you." Without Frederick's permission, Elisabeth wasn't allowed to leave her residence, and as she was never invited to Sanssouci, she could only dream about those wonderful summer nights, and she started to envy those who were allowed to attend. In 1747, Elisabeth got word that Frederick planned a summer trip with his mother and sisters. Against the advice of her new superintendent at court, Lady Camus, the Queen wrote a hopeful letter to her husband, asking to accompany the group on the journey. Elisabeth never received an answer from Frederick, and the trip was made without her. This terrible treatment hurt Elisabeth heavily, but she tried to stay in good spirits. Every time the king announced himself for a visit, Elisabeth put on her best dress and waited for him to finally arrive. Most of the time, he would excuse himself last minute with a letter and stay absent. All these humiliations brought her even more disrespect at court, and over time it made her unsurprisingly very bitter. Elisabeth's friendliness turned into rudeness, and she became known for her sudden mood swings. With all the sadness in her life, Elisabeth had a good relationship with her sister Louise, though, who married a brother of King Frederick. Both of their marriages were unhappy, but Louise had children unlike Elisabeth, who suffered greatly from it. However, she was very involved in her nieces and nephews' upbringing, which gave her some rays of sunshine in her otherwise monotonous life. But with the European territorial quarrels, life was turned upside down yet again. In 1756, another war with Austria and its allies broke out, which left Prussia being surrounded by enemies. Berlin was conquered by Austria in 1760, and Elisabeth was forced to flee. She wouldn't see her husband for 6 years during that war, until peace was formed in 1762. Their reunion is said to have been quite awkward. Frederick remarked that Elizabeth had gotten heavier and went on to talk to his sisters instead. The couple was in their 50s now, and when Frederick continued with his liberal reforms, Elizabeth had to come to terms with her solitude. She kept herself busy with charity work and writing. Some of her works were even published, and she went on to translate French literature and German. After over 40 years of marriage, Elizabeth was still holding on to gaining her husband's affection, and every little glimmer of it was cherished by her. In 1776, the 60-year-old queen suffered from an infection in her leg, and Frederick sent her his personal doctors to take care of it, which delighted Elizabeth tremendously. In 1783, the couple celebrated their golden anniversary in private without having any public celebration, which hurt Elizabeth greatly. Her husband had gotten sick over the years, and he eventually died in 1786 at the age of 74. Elizabeth mourned the death of the husband who had never loved her back greatly. At least Frederick made arrangements in his will for his unloved wife to live carefree as a widow. In her last years, Elizabeth lived a quiet life filled with charity work. She survived her husband by 11 years and died in 1797. She was mourned by the common people, who were thankful for all the goodness and kindness Queen Elizabeth has brought to them, while the Prussian court had almost forgotten her. Elizabeth Christine's story is very tragic in my opinion. She was raised to be a devoted, compliant wife one day, and when she behaved as she was told, it wasn't good enough. The marriage to Frederick was a disaster waiting to happen from the very start. The future King of Prussia was forced by his hated father into the marriage with Elizabeth, which made him resent his wife from the beginning. Frederick was determined to not comply to his father's decision, and oh my, he was serious with it. Besides that, character-wise, the couple was a complete mismatch. Frederick was cultivated, outspoken, and loved lively conversations, while Elizabeth was more pious, sensitive, and quiet. From the story we heard before, one can assume that Frederick was a Yowita woman in general, but he was charming and caring with his mother and sister, for example. All of them were strong-willed women who voiced their opinions and were admired by Frederick for it. To put it simple, they were quite the opposite of Elizabeth. We can only speculate how things would have turned out if Elizabeth wasn't that deeply devoted, almost submissive to her husband. Maybe he would have treated her differently if she was more self-confident and outspoken, but maybe this wouldn't have made a difference since she was Frederick's father's choice. In the end, Elizabeth and Frederick were both victims of a failed marriage politic, but as a woman of her time, Elizabeth suffered greater consequences as she had no freedom to live her life outside of the marriage.